Welcome this evening. Welcome this evening to the SVPMA March event, and happy to see everyone here. We have additional folks joining us. They're running late in internet traffic, as we say. Bad internet roads out there. So a little bit about the new format. We generally start about 5 minutes after the hour. We have a couple of introductions first, and then we'll get rolling as soon as possible with the speaker. Do stick around after the talk. We have an opportunity to network a bit. There's a number of events that we share from the product management calendar around Silicon Valley and other events and items of interest. So it's your chance to do a little bit of networking and maximize your benefit of attending this evening. So with that, I introduce this evening's speaker, Mahesh Ramachandran. He leads management for a company called OpsRamp, which is an operations management subsidiary of HPE. He's been with OnRamp or OpsRamp for 10 years. That includes before and after they were acquired by HPE. So he can speak to being at a new startup in Silicon Valley all the way through, working in a Fortune 500 company that's been a Fortune 500 company since 1962. In terms of responsibilities, he's really focused on product definition, pricing, product strategy. All of these should sound very familiar, critical skills that are make and break skill sets to have in product management. Prior to OpsRamp, he was at VMware, NetScout, and HP. And he's been focused on observability, capacity management, and the network management domains. Mahesh holds a BS and an MS in electrical engineering from UC Davis and an MBA from San Jose State, and he is a patent holder as well. I'm excited to hear about tonight's topic. If you're a classic Silicon Valley innovator and product manager, eventually you will run across an inevitable question. It's one thing to plan and launch new products for a market and customer base that you already know, and those customers are already anticipating your new version of something or your new offering. But the real question that you'll run across is what do you need to do differently if you're starting from a blank slate? So if you are a new startup and this is your first product, or you're creating a new market or a new category, you have some truly Silicon Valley innovation that you're about to roll out. You don't have any existing customers. You've got a blank slate. Where do you take it from there? And with that, I am going to turn things over to Mahesh, and I will stop sharing, and you can start your slides up from there.
Great. Thank you, Tom, for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm just going to share my screen in a second here. Very excited to reconnect here with the SVPMA community. Thank Alok and Tom and the Devashish and the board for the opportunity here to speak on this topic. This is something I'm personally very excited about. I'll go through my background in a second here. I've just had the good fortune of being involved with V1 products, and it's a rewarding experience unlike any other. So I'm excited to share my perspective with you, and hopefully you'll walk away from this meeting with a useful perspective. What I wanted to do was the way I've sort of structured this is really as more of a thought framework, a conceptual framework for how best to think about your designing your V1 product strategy, and what the core principles are that you should be applying. It's less more about more prescriptive, specific, practical tips. I touch upon some of those, but really those specific practical steps, will depend largely on the specific product that you're planning. So I'm happy to, in the Q&A, we can talk about how these principles apply to specific things, I have, as you'll see, a running example to sort of ground some of these principles into a specific example. But just want to let you know that sort of the way I've thought about this and put this material together is more as a conceptual or thought framework for how to go about designing product strategy for one product. Just quickly recap the kind of introduction that Tom had. I'm a product manager. I've been in this role for over 12 years now. Principally, exclusively enterprise products. I have not really coming to you in this context here from a consumer background. My perspective is very much shaped and colored by shipping and managing enterprise products. Have been at HPE. Currently, I'm in HPE. I was at OpsRamp, which was acquired by HPE last year. VMware before that, and NetScout, and the old HP prior to that. And as Tom noted, my experience has been primarily, centered around infrastructure, operations management, observability, systems management in that area. It's about managing IT systems, principally in the infrastructure realm. And as I noted, and the reason I'm excited to have the opportunity to speak to you about this topic is that I've had the good fortune, as I said, to have been involved with launching a pure 1.0 product. And that was an extremely rewarding experience. And then more recently, I've had the opportunity to launch a almost 1.0 product relative to a new market segment. And it is a very different experience. So I'll talk more about that as we go along here. And I also should just communicate sort of the standard disclaimer that I'm presenting my perspective here, not really representing the views of my current or former employers. And I will. There's sort of a break point here in between the two major topics I wanted to cover. So I'll pause and we can do Q&A halfway point, and then we'll do Q&A in the end. And I think we will be able to. I will finish by 8 p.m. So we should be good on time. So I think we can have a longer Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to use, for the sake of just illustrating these principles in concrete ways, use a hypothetical scenario here as to what a scenario that you'd be as a product manager. I'd be speaking to this scenario here, right? So imagine you're a founder of a startup. You and your team just founded a startup, and the basis for that startup was a new product idea that you have. Such a product doesn't exist in the market today, so it is a new category, and you'd potentially be the first to market in that category. And what the rest of this talk and the principles we're going to talk about is really about how to really, really think hard and get this right. How do you bring your product idea to life, make it successful, ship a product, ship a V1, ship a V2. But really, we're going to focus on what it takes to bring this product idea to life, and all the dimensions of the thinking that you have to do to make that happen. That's the premise. And just as there's a specific concrete hypothetical example here, that the product idea I'll be using as a running example is this simple product. It's a product that helps your customers create and track lists. As all of you, I'm sure, can relate to, lists are a very common and everyday piece of information construct that we deal with in our work lives and also in our personal lives, right? Just tracking lists. We almost always, most tasks end up resorting to tracking lists of things. So I'll just use this as an example because I think it allows me to illustrate some of these core principles and apply them to this example. Okay, so with that set up, let's talk about. There are two topics that I like to cover today. One is the first half is really about defining your product, and then the second half is about pricing your product, the pricing structure and the pricing model. We'll spend a good bit of time on this topic here. Really, this is the most important element. I mean, between the two elements, price, defining the product, the feature set, the use cases, the user persona, and all that, and the pricing model. I would say with some conviction that this part is more important to get right, because if you don't get this right, it's very hard to shift course. The pricing model is important. It's the thing that's going to help you translate the value that you're creating in the market to currency. But it's more malleable. You have more opportunities to adjust and fine tune the pricing model. But defining the product definition, it's harder to change course midstream. So we'll spend more time on this topic than pricing topic. But I'll do justice to the pricing topic as well. Okay, so the mental model that I carry in my head is, really all business strategy is product strategy. It all comes down to product. And you as a PM, you hold the keys to the kingdom. And the way I sort of think about product strategy is that it's a book of propositions of that you can categorize them the way that I've categorized them here, that define a particular way in the world could be with your product in the picture. Right? So in this presentation, I'll focus on the top 4 elements of product strategy: use cases, what they are, what they're not, customer segments, how to think about that, really what does it all come down to, feature set, and the pricing model. There are other important elements of product strategy that will be in your, in this mental model, the book that you'll be writing as a PM, starting with a blank set of pages. You're going to be, as a product manager, your task in bringing up the V1 product to life is to write each of these chapters of the book. This constitutes product strategy. And then once you've got it all defined, then you will then bring each of these chapters to life. But let me just talk about these other elements that we're not going to talk about in depth today. Positioning is really about how you want your customers to think about your product relative to other products that they may have, relative to their needs, most importantly. Right? So that's really what it's about. It is a topic unto itself. It's not my area of expertise. As a product manager, I'm more focused on the product definition, and positioning is an important dimension of it, but there's an art to it as well that is more is sort of a handoff point between product management and product marketing, the way I see. But you as a product manager are responsible for helping your marketing team define a positioning, and you'll play a critical role in that. So, but I'm just not talking about that today due to time. And the go-to-market dimension is really about how you're going to reach your customers, right? And again, that's a topic unto itself, and that's an area of expertise, skill, art, and all of that. And so, there's multiple ways to reach the customer that you've identified here. So the key thing is, once you identify your customers, you really have to define ways through which you're going to reach them. And the support experience, again, it cannot be understated. The experience, both the support and the customer success dimensions of the whole product. And you as a product manager should be defining as part of your V1 all these elements. And the key point here I want to convey is, all these chapters of the book, these elements of the strategy have to work together. They have to cohere to deliver the outcome that you're looking for, right? So they all have to come together. So there's connections between them, and going back to what I said earlier, as a product manager, having the opportunity to to work on a V1 product, you get to write all these chapters, and it tests your metal. It shapes your skills and hones your skills as a PM in ways that other experiences do not. So if you get a chance to work on a 1.0 product, I would highly encourage you to raise your hand and pick up that opportunity, because it's really something different. So these elements have to work together, but we'll focus on just the first four and how they work together, and then we'll do Q&A, and then we'll go to pricing. Okay, so let's just talk about use cases first. It is the most important dimension of your product definition. I'm going to use that word a lot, and I'm going to keep coming back to that. Just be aware. Just note, it is the most important thing. Okay. So, what does it mean to define product? What it means to define product is you're going to define the set of problems or customer needs, user needs your product's going to solve. That's the principal thing. Set of needs that your product's going to solve. And your task in writing up that chapter on use cases is threefold. You're going to discover these use cases. You're going to refine them through interaction with your prospects, your users, validate them systematically being the key word, until that chapter feels right. I'll go deeper into what a use case is, what a user persona is, and really what the concepts are that how to think about in a second here, but just bear with me, and as I sort of talk about more abstractly now, and then we'll go into the details. The second dimension of product definition, equally, it is really where the product actually comes together, is the feature set. The way I think about the feature set is it's a set of user-facing constructs that realize those use cases or solve the problems that your product sets out to solve for the user. So the key word being, these are user-facing constructs, and that these are the things, the artifacts that the user sees and touches and interacts with, whether they're APIs or buttons in your UI or dashboards or UI screens, setup screens, whatever they may be. These are user-facing constructs. And the reason I make that distinction in terms of between a user-facing construct and something that is not a user-facing construct is that that distinction is extremely important as you interact with your engineering teams. In my experience, there is a realization of those constructs, in architecture and in how the products put together behind the screen, so to speak, behind the stage. But as a product manager, you and only you as a product manager exclusively have domain over what those user-facing constructs are, what user experience they should render for the user. It is really worth thinking about this a little bit, and please note your questions, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A session. If it's really important to have that distinction clear in your head, establish that distinction between you and your engineering teams. If you don't, so the risk of not having that distinction clear is that you end up having confused conversations between, okay, the realization of the feature, the architecture, and the engineering of a feature, and really what it means to the user, right? So it's really, really important to define that boundary as to what is the user-facing construct, where does the user-facing concept is, and where does it end, and what's really implementation behind that, right? So that's an important point. I just want to, it's really important for you to, operationally, it becomes extremely important as you have difficult, in the course of shipping a 1.0 product, you can expect to have many difficult conversations, both with your customers and with your engineering and counterparts and your marketing counterparts, and really getting this straight is important. The other important point I wanted to emphasize here is that the use cases shape the feature set. The directionality is strictly this way. This is really important to keep this in mind. The feature set is really shaped by the use cases, not the other way around. Or the other way around is circular thinking. Now, as you're conceptualizing your product and you've got all these ideas and your team members have ideas, feature ideas can occur and will occur first sometimes, or often, I should say. In a creative process, ideas just come in any order. And oftentimes they originate here. And there's spurious, and such is the nature of creative thinking and creative enterprises. There's really no order or rationale to how those thoughts occur, those ideas occur. The most important thing is that as a product manager, your job is to take that set of feature ideas that were produced in the course of your own thinking of your brainstorming sessions with your team, with your other members of the organization, and go back and systematically arrange those ideas post hoc in a sequential, logical chain of reasoning fashion, and rationalizing them against use cases. It's extremely important, that step, and you own that, again, as a product manager of a V1 product, or even beyond that. You own that, and you alone own that as a PM, that process. In that process, you may find, and as I have found myself oftentimes, some ideas that seem, like really cool ideas here don't pan out. They don't really rationalize and derive from your use cases, and you'll prune those features out. And you'll do this iteratively. It's extremely important to do this systematically, right? So the use cases are your axioms, basically, for the product, right? So you think of the definition of a product is like a set of theorems for your propositions for the value your product creates. The use cases are the axioms. Those are the fundamental needs that you're designing for. So extremely important that you keep this directionality in mind all the time. If you get this, if you confuse the direction of the arrow, you can end up with either rationalizing a feature, with sort of false premise, circular premise, or you won't be able to explain it to a customer at the end of the day, when features show up in the product, and you should be able to explain to your users what use case that feature was intended to solve and why it is the way it is. And if you can do that with credibly and with conviction, in my experience, your customers will actually respect that, and customers will will appreciate what you've done. And sometimes the customer may ask you for a feature that really necessarily doesn't really solve the real use case, or having grounding in why the intention behind why you put together the features the way you put this together, and why the feature set is the way you designed it, and rationalizing it against the use case is extremely important. As a PM, you should be able to explain every feature in your product, which use case it's intended to solve, or which sequence of use cases is intended to solve. Really important. So that's so I just wanted to spend some time there. So let's dig a little deeper here as to what these use cases are, what the feature set, really what it all comes down to. Okay, so here's sort of how I think about a use case. So the start of the user persona. So a user persona is an idealized user. Idealized meaning it's a construct in your head. It's a composite of the real world users that you expect that will have the need to solve the problems that your product solves. So it's important to really have this user persona defined, written up in a document, in a slide, pasted in the walls. Your PM team, your engineering team, your marketing team should all be aligned on who that persona is. If you don't have alignment on that leads to other execution challenges, right? Your UX team may design for a persona that doesn't match the persona that you have in mind, or your UI and APIs may be designed for another persona that really doesn't exist. So it's really important to have this in mind. Now, the thing about sort of thinking even deeper about a persona is that the user persona has these use cases, which are statements about the problems that or functional needs that they have. But those needs themselves arise as the user persona is executing or going about doing other activities that are unrelated to your product. So the second level, this meta level of thinking, is also extremely important, because this is really about what is giving rise to the use cases that your product solves. And it's really important to understand that second level of rationalization of your use cases. At the end of the day, your product is solving use cases that are really incidental. They're really incidental or contingent to other activities the persona is trying to accomplish, and they just happen to have these needs in the course of doing those other things. There are many reasons to have really solid grounding in that surrounding context, and you should really have a write-up of why these use cases, what the surrounding context is, and why these use cases even arise. One of the reasons is important is that as you engage the market and let's say you ship your V1, we'll go back and touch upon this later in the presentation today. You have to watch out for that surrounding context. If that is shifting in a way that makes your use cases irrelevant or mitigates the severity with which your user needs, to solve those use cases, you need to be aware of that as a PM. You need to pick up on that. So if you don't have that background framework in mind as to how these use cases or where they even come from, then you cannot watch for if the ground underneath you is shifting over time. So really, the surrounding context is extremely important, within which then you situate your use cases. So let's apply this to this list keeper example here. Okay, so if I apply this principle to the list keeper product idea, the surrounding context here would be, there's just one surrounding context. It's not all of it. It's not the exhaustive list of surrounding contexts, but one example here is office workers working on a team project, right? That'll be an example here. And in the course of working on a team project, the use case of being able to track lists of to-dos, assign to-dos, update my to-do list, share these lists, review the status of to-dos, those use cases simply arise just as a contingency or a incidental outcome of office workers trying to do their team project, right? So that's an example here. I hope that illustrates the point. And depending on your product, you've got to really map out these different surrounding contexts and the user personas. And the general sort of rule of thumb here, you should have no more than 3 user personas, but really 1 or 2. If you're designing for more than 2 user personas, you may not have a good product idea. You may be solving a set of problems that straddle 2 products. We'll talk about what a litmus test is, whether you've got this all right in a couple of minutes here, but but just, you really should have one or two user personas for your product. Then you've got a coherent set of problems that are that fit into one product. Okay. Now let's talk about the feature set. That's the second part of the product definition. The chapter that you need to write. Again, these are user-facing constructs that realize the use cases. You really have to continue to keep that in mind as you think through and work on your V1 product. The second thing to keep in mind is features need, the features really work together to render a use case. So the features may, more often than not, they're used in conjunction with each other to solve the use case. And it's extremely important because of that reason and other reasons that these features, there's a coherency to the use case, meaning these use cases sort of flow into each other, they work with each other, they work together with each other to render a solution to the customer's problem. I'll show you an example in a second. And again, as a PM, your job is to, your job is to be the keeper of the coherency of these use cases, the integrity of these features, how they connect together. It is your job, and uniquely your job, to make sure that they add up. They add up to delivering more than the sum of their, creates these features work together to create more value than the sum of their parts. And this is something you keep watching out for all the time as a product, right? And this goes beyond a 1.0 product, but even for a 1.0 product, you need to really make sure that the feature set is minimal. It solves just the problems you want to solve. You're not over-featuring your product. You're the keeper of all those decisions. You're the decision maker of all those things. And then the other thing about this feature set is that this is really, is an unbounded really an unbounded space of possibilities for how you can solve these use cases once you have those use cases clearly defined. And it's really bounded by your imagination and the technology that's available at that point in time. It's important to keep that in mind that over time, as the state of the art on technology in the industry you're in advances, there may be other ways to solve those use cases. The thing that's invariant are the use case and the needs, assuming the surrounding context is invariant. Then there's multiple ways to solve these use cases, and that gives rise to new opportunity to create new features or better features or that replace other features, right, to solve those use cases. So, but this is a considerable, as a PM or as a engineering team, together working on the product. This part is exciting. There's a lot of room for creativity here, and how do I solve these use cases, right? And that's really what makes up your feature set. Okay, so if I were to apply this principle to ListKeeper, again, very simple example, right? So here's an example that illustrates why these features need to cohere. They need to work together, right? So I have a need to create a list, and you may have three ways that you offer in your product to create a list. I can go to the UI and open up, start a new list. I may provide a feature for a user to simply email to my product a list by text, and they'll automatically create that list. Or I could provide an API to create a list so that your product can be integrated with other products. There's three ways to create a list in this example, three features. Now, your users will want to have, get some metadata about a list, who created the list, when it was created, etc. So that's another feature, right? You're going to, either in the UI or through APIs or other means, you're going to offer a feature or multiple features for a user to get metadata about a list, right? And so the key thing here is no matter how the list was created, it should all capture the same metadata, and they should be, consistent. You cannot have different metadata depending on how the list was created. So that's an example of how these features, need to work together. So that's, and I'm watching the time here, and I'm going to go a little bit faster here to get to the other half of the product, the presentation. So I hope that, illustrated sort of what a feature set is. I'll leave you on this section with two important, with a few important points here, more practical tips. Number one is, as a PM for V1, especially for a V1, really you should invest in the discovery process. And you need to really be highly analytical about that in applying that, in going through that discovery process. It's always good to enroll a small core of friendly users. These are potential users of your product as design partners. That's sort of the term that I use. These are folks that are interested in giving you feedback. They're willing to listen to your ideas. You really need a small core of friendly users to help you think through this and validate your use cases. And as a 1.0 product, and even really beyond 1.0, your product should be really focused on solving, a small number of use cases. A product that solves unrelated, 10 use cases that are unrelated is not a product. There's multiple products. And as a PM, it's extremely important. Again, I'm pointing out things that really unique or exclusively a PM's responsibility. You need to define litmus test to establish that you've got this part right. Because if you get this part right, I'm speaking with a little bit of conviction here from experience, everything else follows. If you don't get this part right, things don't go well. Right? You've got to get this part right. So you need to, in written form, establish a litmus test that anybody can read the reasoning there and read your write-up and see and agree. They agree with your line of reasoning. How to establish that you've got it right. So examples of things that would go, criteria that would go there, or how are your users solving their use cases today? Because I should have brought this up earlier. Almost always, your product is an alternative to a different way in which the customer is solving their use cases today. The need is always there. It's always been there, oftentimes. And you're just offering a better alternative than the alternatives that they have today, right? So the existence of those alternatives, in the case of ListKeeper, what are the alternatives, for example? They may be using spreadsheets, or they may be using text editors or Word docs to maintain their lists. But those are alternatives, and your product is going to offer a better alternative. So the fact that customers are solving that use case using other alternatives establishes that those needs are real. Another one is, again, common sense. Would you buy your own product? Do you and your team experience those use cases yourself? Right? It doesn't have to be rocket science to define this litmus test, but it's important to have a well-reasoned, structured approach to establishing this. And then on the feature set, I would say it is really worth the time to invest in high-fidelity UX mockups. I'm not talking about wireframes and so on. I think that those have limited utility in my view. Really, you want to show the real deal to the customer. What is the product actually going to look like, both on the UX side and the API side? And it really brings into sharp focus what the user is actually going to get and what the user experience is going to be. So you can get meaningful feedback with your design partners. And you should have, this is really, it's hard to do with discipline, but it is important. You should have measures of how well you're solving the user experience part. Number of clicks to solve a use case, number of scrolls, the degree of scrolling, recall time for how you're solving these use cases. You need to have a vocabulary internal to your team that really, where you can have more analytical conversations about these, right? Do I have the user experience right? So I just shared a few practical tips, and obviously these will depend on the specifics of the product, the domain in which you're building your product. I hope that that gave you some grounding in really this first part of we'll go back here, right? So we talked about use cases and feature set. This constitutes the definition of the product. So I'm going to pause here for Q&A, and then we'll pick up on pricing model. Let's see how many questions there are.
Yeah, we've got a number of questions in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to call those up and read those, or if you want. Yeah.
I'll do that. Yes. Let's see here. Okay. Shouldn't Ash is asking, shouldn't product strategy be the step that goes from vision to roadmap? Yes, it is, and that's the stuff we've talked about. Is what does it take to go from this high level idea to an actual artifact that you ship and bring to market and the customers can use? That's what we talked about. It's all the stuff in between, right? And I think Reza also value proposition come before, and in the language that I was using, use cases add up to value proposition. So I think the other question here, I'm sharing my screen chat window, so I hope others can see the questions as well. Can you touch upon use cases that relate to data products or APIs? Okay. An example of API's use case. So the API is not the use case. The API is a solution, is a feature to solve a use case. So the API endpoint is there a use case? So specifically, the structure of the endpoint is a feature that solves a use case. So here's an example. So let's say I'll just make it. Let's say I have a SaaS product and I have two API endpoint. I have an API endpoint that is generic, meaning it is not, that API endpoint doesn't carry any customer ID or anything. It's just a generic public endpoint that's reachable on the internet. Now, that would be one way to render, a solution to your use case of customers being able to access your API. Another way to solve that same use case would be a customer-specific API endpoint, and there may be, a use case that warrants that the API endpoint is not generic and public, or generic, but it is actually customer specific or account specific, right? So these are some of the nuances that you need to really, really think through. What does the use case call for? If the use case calls for all customers, there is no real reason for a customer to have a customer specific API endpoint, then don't build a customer specific API endpoint. But there are some cases where customers need customer specific endpoints. There are legit reasons for that. And so you need to account for that, right? Okay, it all goes back to the customer need, and is there a need for it? And how you put your feature together, your product together, really is shaped by that. No, in your example, use case seems to synonymous with key user actions. I didn't mean it to be that. The use case is a more abstract description. It's a proposition or a description of a customer need. Let me go back here. It's important to double click here. So I didn't get a chance to maybe double click on. So a use case is functional need that your persona has, independent of whether your product exists or any product exists. That's the level of abstraction at which you need to be thinking about a use case. The use case is a description of a need that exists. That need exists whether you're in the market solving it or another product's in the market solving it. That use case exists, and your job is to get to that, uncover that underlying need, right? So use cases are abstract things, and it is hard to get to them, but that's the art of the PM, being a PM. And how you cut the use case, how you see the proposition, how you see the use case is in itself, a key part of the product strategy. So use case is a more abstract thing. It's not user action. It's more abstract than that. Right. I totally agree with the other comment from Ash. Because of Jira and Agile framework, use case, user stories are lower level things. Features are even are lower level things. So in my mind, this is my opinion here. I hope nobody's. These tools really try to impose some kind of. In my mind, the Agile framework tools are really. They are they try to impose certain ways in which they force you to do things or think. They're not really tools that foster critical thinking. They're good for mechanics of tracking lists and tracking bugs and tracking tracking ways where your feature specs live and so on. But they're not a substitute for thought. Tools are not a substitute for thought. The job here is about thought, right? Tools are not a substitute for thinking. So don't over rely on tools. Tools are good for mechanical things, but it's just a tool. It's just a tool, right? So I would in all this this whole conversation, I would just disregard tools. It's really not that useful to think about tools. Just it's your head, your customers, your users, how you think about the space, right? That's really what it is. Right. So how do you go about finding a startup team that's willing to go through discipline or market focus? Yeah. So it not just yeah, it is a good point Sandra makes that oftentimes they're not. I've seen it myself a lot. A bunch of people get together, they build something, and then product managers are hired as an afterthought. I think it's always good speaking as a PM. If I would have found a company and if I would have funded a company, I would bring the PM as a first hire. But that's not how the real world works. But that would be, in my mind, the better way to do it. You've got to start with the problem, and the PM is the one that's going to validate the problem, and you can save a lot of time and money in establishing the problem and the use case first, and before you start building stuff. Okay, if you have an amazing idea, when do you or how do you determine it's a good idea to go after? So again, I think that question, I don't think it's hard. So if you have an amazing idea, then the thing you need to do to establish that it's an amazing idea is validate that n number of customers have that idea, and the pain point you're solving is severe enough that they're willing to forego other things to pay for it, right? That's when you have a real idea, is that you get the reaction of, I want this problem solved yesterday kind of thing, right? That's a test. When you test these ideas with your customers and they tell you, I have this problem, I can show it to you. I wish if you saw, I had the solution yesterday, right? That's the reaction you get, right? Okay, so Paul's making Tom's got a good reference here for mob test. All right, so great, guys. So that's really, I enjoyed those questions, and I think that's really some good discussion. So let me now, in the interest of time, just move forward to the other topic, which is pricing. So I'll be a little bit more quick here because of time. So here now this is, what are your goals in writing the pricing chapters of your book, or your product strategy book, right? So in my mind, the way I think about the goal is the pricing, the goal of your pricing model, talk about what it is to acquire target customers profitably, right? That's the goal. And so really the way I would describe this in the book, in my product strategy book, would be, the pricing model are the terms of the contract, or the terms under which you're offering a product to the market to elicit a certain response from the market. You're just defining the terms under which you're going to offer your product in order to elicit a certain response that you desire from the market. That's really all it is. That's the function pricing serves. And there are two components to the pricing model. There is a unit of price, the units of consumption that you're going to charge for. That's what that first piece here is. And then how you're going to tier the feature set or the units of consumption. Are you going to tier at all or not, right? So those are the two dimensions. There may be other dimensions, but these are the two that come to mind, the principle. So when I say pricing structure, it means two things: unit of price, unit of consumption, or unit of price, and then and how you're going to chunk it up in terms of what the dimension is along which you're going to chunk it. And a customer segment, again, this is a set of customers with the same buying behavior. And I'm distinguishing here between user persona that we talked about earlier and customer segments. User persona is a functional user, the user that's going to use your product on a daily basis. The customer or customer segment is the buyer of your product, and they may not be the same. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. depending on the market. And so the customer segment is sort of a set of customers with the same buying behavior. That's really what it is. And also the customers can shift from one segment to another. And really part of your job as an organization, as a company, would be to shift your customers from one segment to another so that it favors you, your company, and your product. And you want to say you have your premium product, you want to advance your customers from free use of the product to a segment that's willing to pay for it, right? So that you're shaping your demand for the product to shift them from one segment to another, right? So that's what a customer segment is. So sort of here's an illustration of it. Your target customers. I got a segment 1, I got a subsegment 2. And the reason I bring up the segmentation is because if you're going to tier your product, you have to have clarity on which segment fit you're targeting each tier for, right? So if you have let's say a low price version or a standard, basic, here's an example, right? So I've got, say for list keeper, I've got I'm the unit of my pricing, the unit of consumption is 100 lists, right, at a time. So I'm going to charge on the basis of dollars per 100 lists. So I could tier it along 2 dimensions, basic features and the full featured version. So here I have $5 per 100 lists and $8 for, right? And so maybe segment 2 would be for essentials and segment 1 would be for standard. And the reason is important to really have well-defined segments like this is you need to think about, okay, who's going to fit into segment 2? Are there any customers that even fit into segment 2? That's what it helps you really think through, right? So can you imagine a set of customers who'd be perfectly happy to just live with the essential features that you put into the essentials tier of your product, and then likewise in the other direction on standard, and then you need to establish that, right? If you don't really think about it in terms of segments, it's really hard to then rationalize why you even have tiering in the first place. And you may find that you don't need to have tiering. I mean, the purpose of segmenting customers is to make those decisions. And so here's another example here on the segmentation side. Enterprises meaning just of all kinds, small, medium, large, doesn't matter in this example. And all enterprises, that's segment 1, right? Segment 2 could be enterprises that allow users to purchase their own product for work use. So many enterprises don't, smaller enterprises do, right? When I was in a smaller company, I could buy all the software that I wanted for my work use and just charge it to the company. Now, when I'm a bigger company, this corporate level purchasing that I have to go, you can only use software that's authorized at the corporate level, right? So you need to think about it because it matters to your pricing model. It matters to your go-to-market strategy. And then, in this example, schools, university will be another segment altogether. They may also have the same functional needs in terms of creating lists and maintaining lists and so on. Functionally, they may be identical, but from a pricing and from a go-to-market standpoint, they are different. So this kind of segmentation, the finer the segmentation is, the more analytical you are about segmenting your customers, the better off you are. And it helps you make certain decisions. It helps you think about decision in the future when you have to adjust your pricing model. You've got to lay down this framework so that you and your teams can sit together and really have a rational discussion about really what are we doing here and why are we doing this, right? Okay, now that's the structure, just as the pricing structure. And just shift gears, talk about the price point, right? Like how much you're actually going to charge. And there's a lot here, and I may not have time here because I've got only 5 minutes left. There's a lot to unpack here, but I'll just be brief here, right? So a couple of points. So the amount you're going to charge for your product, it frames perception of your product. It's really an important thing to keep in mind. Your price, drives perception. So really important point, and we don't have time to go into all the reasons why, but meaning really what the implications of that. But price and perception, they go together. So really be mindful of that. The price point shapes your customer acquisition model and your customer base. Let me just see if I can unpack these two pictures here. So this picture here on the left is really, consider this to be a slider, a scale along which you're moving the slider as a PM to set your price point for that unit of consumption. So in the previous example, it was, dollars per 100 lists, right? So you as a PM, you get to slide this up or down to set the dollars per 100 lists, the price point. And then the right-hand side is the kind of the demand curve. Again, you will never have perfect information, and these demand curves are just notional things, but it's extremely important to think about them as a demand curve. So it's like a classic demand curve, except you've got unit price on the y-axis and the number of customers that you'll acquire or you're likely to acquire at a given price point, a unit price. Right? It's not total volume of product, but number of customers. So let me just start very briefly here. So cost, oftentimes I hear this trope about, hey, it's value-based pricing versus cost-based pricing. In the real world, it's both. You cannot not be mindful of your cost. Price point cannot be oblivious to the cost point. So at the base of all this, at the floor of all this is the cost, and you've got to be extremely, especially if it's a SaaS product, the unit costs are non-zero. The unit cost of producing one unit of product is not zero. If you disregard dev costs, which you should also factor in. So SaaS product non-zero, but costs are never zero. So that sets the floor. Then there's the other point in the scale that you need to be mindful of or think about carefully. What are the price of alternatives to solving those same problems for my customer, right? So there's all, like I said, your use case or your product or your feature set is solving some contingent need that the customer is already solving using other means today. And so you've got to really arrive at what cost they're incurring in solving the problem using alternatives. Because that's the other point on that scale. And then steady state value, when you ship your 1.0, it's not going to be full featured, it's going to be just the basics, but you really have to price for your V3. And you've got to think ahead. Here's the value I'm going to create a year from now or 6 months from now. So you want to price to that, not to the product you have today. And this now gets into the other choice point here, gets into the per customer revenue. Again, I really call it a choice point because it is a choice point. You slide this, you go further down to the right on the demand curve, you can acquire more customers at a lower unit price, but that has implications for your customer acquisition model, for your support model, and so on. Likewise, beyond a certain price, unit price, your customer acquisition model, meaning your go-to-market model, you're bound to certain ways of acquiring customers beyond a certain price point. So, where you put your slider on the scale, has serious implications for your business, right? So you got to think about all that to decide where you put that slider. I'm going to end here. A couple of points here, and then we can do a Q&A. I hope the Q&A may run over 2 minutes or so.
We're okay if we're slide a few minutes. That's not gonna.
Okay, thanks.
We're not running out of recording tape.
Okay. Okay. So now, a few closing points on customer segment pricing model. Clarity on how your pricing model supports your customer acquisition goals. That's important. Having that straight line of sight and line of reasoning really on how your pricing model supports the customer acquisition goal. That equation is extremely important to have it written down. And then this demand curve business here, and this picture here, you should have an internally consistent model of how your customers, your market is going to respond to your price point. You won't have perfect information. Nobody's going to have perfect information, but the analytical process of developing a consistent model is important because it's going to help you make decisions, not just for 1.0, but post 1.0, how you're going to fine tune the model. If you don't have a framework to think about it, what is the basis of you won't have a basis to make these decisions. And obviously you will validate your pricing model with the sample of prospective customers. And in my experience, that the sample can be very small. You don't need a lot of data points to know that you got this right. 5, 10 samples. It generalizes very quickly. You don't need a big sample there. And then it's quickly just on beyond 1.0, continue to be vigilant to make sure your use cases continue to be relevant, right? That's the most important thing. Which you will do deep dive sessions with the V1, really pick up on the nuances. The details matter, the nuances matter to the customer experience. Everything, every detail matters. No detail is unimportant. Let me put it that way. No detail is unimportant. So you should spend a lot of time with your user base. And then if you got the V1 right, in my experience, the V2 priorities just flow naturally. I mean, the chapter 2 of your book writes itself almost, right? So that's a test of whether you've got what V1 right. All right, so I'm going to close here. Taking a 1.0 product from concept to launch is extremely valuable, rewarding experience. You learn things that you wouldn't learn otherwise, and really sharpens you as a PM. So if you get a chance, please, I encourage all of you to, as fellow PMs, to take that opportunity. I want to go back and make that important point. Getting that use cases right, getting those use cases right, that's critical. And finally, it's all about the user. It's about the user. Be grounded in your user's needs all the time. Really, the user is whom you're building the product for. You got to continue to be grounded in that. I'm going to close it here and just open it up for questions, and then we can end the session.
Yeah, we've got a few good questions in the chat window already.
Okay, so we have one for, let's see, one from Sandra here. Do you find you can openly ask enterprise prospects? Yes, absolutely, yes, you can, and they will appreciate it. I've gone to customers and tested price points. Don't feel coy to. Customers appreciate these questions. Just okay. On the tiered pricing of APIs, let me just make sure I understood the question. Right.
And if you could repeat the question or just summarize, because that doesn't always make.
So what's the good basis to tier pricing for tiered pricing of APIs? Do you chunk them on the basis of number of API calls, and what's the overage policy? And do you charge for an overage? Do you have an overage rate? It's a good question. In general, having the rule of thumb has been in the industry, no more than 3 tiers. And there are there's many choices of how the tiers are, the dimension along which you tier your APIs in your example, Ash. On the basis of volume, that'll be the one, I guess, feels most natural for API calls. And certainly you should have. So here's the thing with the API calls, and I talked about this briefly. There's always a cost, right? So if you're going to have, for these volume-based things, it'll always be good to have that overage rate, so that if they exceed that rate and it has cost implications for you, you can capture that additional value. So I would say, tiering with overage, basic entitlement. So let's say you didn't tier, you just have Pro or Enterprise, and one option would be just have one tier and then have a entitlement of a certain number of API calls for that, and then an overage rate for any excess over that. That may be simpler than tiering in the case of APIs, but you got to look at the specific use cases for your APIs. So as you know that the implication of having these tiers is that you have to then upsell, and somebody has to be involved in that upsell, even if you make it self-service, for the customer to upsell themselves or buy up themselves. It is still introducing friction. So the fewer decisions your customer makes, or you have to recommend that they make, the simpler. So I would say, please think about that. There's complexity to tiering. Hope that was helpful. So those are the two questions I have here. Any other questions? I can take them now, or we can close
Additional?
this session.
We'll see if anybody has any further comments. We'll give it just a minute here. I think it's been indicative, the number of questions that have come in the chat window, that this was resonating with a lot of folks, and they were really thinking along as you're presenting this. So it's quite helpful. We've just got a few additional questions popped in. So
Okay, sure. Yeah, if I'm okay on time, then I can.
Yeah.
Do you have any pro tips to retrofit the approach in a tech PM world where engineers and functional PMs are often the client? Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, if you're building a product that's targeting engineers and functional PMs as your end users, I hope, I assume that's what you mean, Jonathan. So it actually, in my experience, is easier and it's more of a pleasure to, to have like-minded folks or on the other side of the table in terms of as a customer, you can get to more clarity quickly. So I would say you apply the same approach. You wouldn't do anything different. You can be even more sharp about your questions to them because they understand why you're asking these questions, because they're dealing with these questions themselves. And so I would say just apply the same approach, but just even you can be even more direct and even more clear on, okay, well, is this use case really matter to you, or get into the weeds on specific, function, feature ideas and so on. It's even easier to build a product for people in sort of in the same general domain. Where do you get your prospects to validate with past? Yes, it's a good question. So with Sander, where do you get your prospects to validate with? So there's more to it than, it's not a simple answer actually. So the key principle there would be really the good design partners, in my terminology I was using, is people that are really trying to solve the problems that are running into the problems that your product aims to solve. It doesn't matter whether they're past customers or your colleagues. You should try to avoid for lack of a better metaphor, searching for the keys where the light is, right? I mean, if you go to your colleagues and VC contacts because that's all you can reach, you may be missing out on perspectives that you'd be getting if you really went after the right people. So I would say you got the best prospects are those that are experiencing the pain points that your product is intended to solve. Those are the best prospects, and you can find them in many ways. It doesn't have to be, there's many ways to find them more practically. Yeah. More here, I think.
So Paul had a question. What are your thoughts about using low code or no code as a product manager to build a product?
I don't have a deep perspective on that, other than if the low code approach solves it renders your feature set in a scalable, architecturally sound way, that would be an implementation choice you make with your engineering team. If on the low code front, if the low code approach helps you prototype and to build a proof of concept that you can test and iterate with rapidly, that would be a good reason to use that approach, right? I mean, the more you can get something real in your users' hands that maybe is not an at scale product quickly, the better. So that's one thought that comes to mind there. Mehul has great presentation, Mahesh. Systematic approach. Thank you, Mehul. Yeah, thanks for being more direct. Great trip. Okay. 0 to 1 products, selecting the right design partner. Yeah. So again, this is quality in terms of selecting design partner. Quality is better than quantity here. So pick design partners that are, again, experiencing the use cases that are there, or are even farther ahead of where you're, of the rest of the market. It's and there's many creative ways to find them. I mean, many creative ways to find these folks that are doing the things that eventually your other users will be doing. So it really that's really the good advice or suggestion I would have. Find people that are doing things that give rise to the use case your product solves. There are many ways to find them.
Very good. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up the Q&A session. Please don't leave the call just yet. We've got a few additional things to throw there. But I wanted to thank you for presenting this evening, and I think everybody got a great deal out of this. This has been an interesting walkthrough, and it's always great to be able to sit with somebody who's been on the journey
Right.
and kind of hear like, okay, here's how we broke down the problems, and just having a framework in a way, some thought that you can apply to this monumental thing that's in front of you and be able to break it down piece by piece is really valuable for folks to kind of get unstuck and see where they are and make a plan and manage to that. So I think that's exceptionally helpful for our audience out there this evening. And thank you so much for being generous with your time.